In January of 1888, a man named Elias Vorney made an announcement that shocked even the most hardened frontier marshals in the Nebraska Territory. Men who had seen drought swallow families whole, men who had buried children in frozen ground without ceremony, men who believed they had witnessed everything the plains could do to a human soul. He did not announce it as a warning, not as a plea, not as the desperate cry of a man watching his community unravel at the seams, but as an instruction, a calm, deliberate, almost liturgical instruction, delivered from the steps of Blackwood's only church on the morning of January 11th, 1888, while the sky above the prairie turned the color of a bruise. He told every man, woman, and child in the town of Blackwood, Nebraska, all 231 of them, to walk north, into the open field, into the white. He told them to keep walking until God told them to stop. And the most disturbing part, the detail that has haunted every historian, every folklorist, every desperate archivist who has ever stumbled across the sealed Custer County records from that winter, is not that he said it. It is that they listened. By the morning of February 3rd, Elias Vorney's face had been altered in ways that the two surviving witnesses could never adequately describe. Not disfigured by frostbite, not hollowed by starnation, but changed, as though something behind his eyes had been replaced with something older and far less merciful. 219 people were dead, scattered across 11 miles of open Nebraska plain, like scattered seed that would never take root. The town of Blackwood itself, its church, its mill, its schoolhouse, its jail, had been emptied so completely that when the Custer County deputy arrived 3 weeks later, he found every door standing open, every fire burned to cold ash, every table still set for a meal that no one had ever eaten. There was no struggle. There were no signs of panic. There was only the snow, and the footprints leading north, and the silence of a place that had chosen, or been made, to simply cease to exist. Before we uncover the disturbing truth behind what happened in Blackwood, Nebraska, subscribe to this channel, hit that bell so you never miss a story like this one, and drop your country, state, or city in the comments right now. I want to see exactly how far this story reaches, because what happened on those plains in 1888 is something they have spent over a century trying to make sure you never heard.
The winter of 1888 in Nebraska was not a season, it was a sentence. The plains of Custer County in that year existed in a state of permanent, suffocating gray, a landscape so flat and so vast that the horizon ceased to feel like a boundary and began to feel like a threat. The grasses that in summer rolled golden and endless had been beaten down to brittle black stubble by October, and by the time January arrived, even that stubble had disappeared beneath a sheet of ice so thin and so treacherous that cattle had been found dead in the mornings, legs broken at the knee from simply walking across their own pastures in the dark. The sky during those weeks before the great storm was the particular shade of white that old-timers called a dead sky, not the bright white of fresh snowfall, not the pale blue of a cold, clear morning, but the flat, textureless, lightless white of a world that had simply run out of color. The wind came from the northwest in long, low, almost musical waves, pressing against the walls of buildings with a sound that the settlers described in their letters home as breathing, not howling, not roaring, breathing, slow, patient, and deeply uninterested in whether you survived. The town of Blackwood itself sat approximately 40 miles south of the Loup River, unreachable by rail, connected to the nearest supply depot in Broken Bow by a single rutted wagon road that flooded in spring, baked to concrete in summer, and in winter became indistinguishable from the surrounding plain. The town had been founded in 1881 by a congregation of roughly 60 families, most of them transplants from Ohio and western Pennsylvania, all of them drawn west by the Homestead Act and the particular brand of evangelical optimism that believed God had personally reserved the Nebraska Territory as a reward for the righteous. By 1888, Blackwood had grown to 231 souls. It had a church, a general store, a mill, a one-room schoolhouse, a blacksmith, a jail with 2 cells that had never once been occupied, and a cemetery at its northern edge that by January of that year already held 43 graves, most of them children under the age of 5, most of them taken by the winters that preceded the one that would take everyone else. The smell of Blackwood in winter was wood smoke and animal, and something underneath both of those things, a faint mineral coldness that came up from the frozen earth itself, like the ground was exhaling. At night, with the wind pressed flat against the shutters and the oil lamps burning low to conserve fuel, the town sounded like it was slowly being compressed, the creak of timber contracting in the cold, the distant low of cattle too numb to move, the silence between those sounds so complete and so heavy that people reported hearing their own heartbeats and finding them strange.
To understand what happened in Blackwood, you must first understand what it meant to own land in the Nebraska Territory in 1888, and more importantly, what it meant to owe it. The Homestead Act had promised 160 acres to any settler willing to file a claim, build a dwelling, and work the land for 5 years. What it had not mentioned, what none of the government pamphlets or railroad advertisements or evangelical recruiters had seen fit to include, was the drought cycle. Nebraska's plains operated on a brutal and deeply predictable rhythm of wet years followed by dry ones, and the early 1880s had been wet enough to seduce an entire generation of settlers into believing the land was something it was not. By 1887, the dry years had returned. Crops that had yielded 40 bushels of corn per acre in 1882 were yielding 8. Wells that had run clear and cold were running brown and shallow. Cattle that had grazed the open range were being found dead at the fences, too weak to push through to the next patch of edible grass. In Blackwood, as in 100 other small Nebraska towns, this agricultural collapse intersected with something far more dangerous than mere poverty. It intersected with debt. The majority of Blackwood's families had borrowed money to break their land, to buy their seed, to purchase the equipment that homesteading required. That money had come almost entirely from a single source, the Cheatham Land and Agricultural Credit Company, a private lending firm based in Omaha, represented in Blackwood by its regional agent, a man named Corwin Falk, who arrived in town twice a year, once in July and once in January, to collect payments, assess properties, and make decisions about which families would be allowed to remain on their land and which would be issued notices of foreclosure. By January of 1888, Corwin Falk held paper on 64 of Blackwood's 78 homestead properties. The families who did not owe Cheatham land money owed it to neighbors who did. There was no economic life in Blackwood that did not, in some direction, eventually lead back to Falk and the company he represented. He controlled, in practical terms, whether Blackwood continued to exist, and he knew it. He wore that knowledge the way other men wore expensive coats, visibly, deliberately, and with the clear intention of making everyone in the room feel the cold by contrast. The law, such as it was, offered these families nothing. The county sheriff was based in Broken Bow, 40 miles away on an impassable winter road. The territorial courts moved slowly and ruled consistently in favor of creditors. The church, Blackwood's Church of the Redeemed Prairie, led by the Reverend Elias Vorn, was the only institution in town that stood between the community and complete dissolution, and by the winter of 1888, even that institution had been quietly, methodically, and almost surgically compromised.
In the Nebraska Territory in 1888, religion was not a Sunday practice, it was infrastructure. In a place without courts you could reach, without doctors you could afford, without neighbors close enough to call in an emergency, the church and its minister functioned as judge, physician, counselor, and crisis manager simultaneously. When a child died in the night, it was Elias Vorn who sat with the family until morning. When two men disputed a property boundary, it was Vorn who arbitrated. When a woman's mind broke under the isolation and the cold and the grief of the plains, and this happened more often than any official record acknowledges, it was Vorn who determined whether she was suffering from melancholy or something the community needed to be protected from. He was, in the most literal and operational sense of the word, the most powerful person in Blackwood, more powerful than Corwin Falk, because Falk held the land, but Vorn held something that the people of Blackwood valued more completely than land. He held their certainty. He held their explanation for why they were suffering and what it meant, and what, if they endured it correctly, it would eventually produce. What was unthinkable in Blackwood in 1888, what would have caused immediate and total social exile for any person who expressed it openly, was doubt. Not doubt in the abstract philosophical sense, but the specific, prairie-forged doubt of a woman standing in her doorway in November, watching her third consecutive failed harvest being carted away by creditors, and thinking the thought that could not be spoken, that God had not, in fact, reserved this land for the righteous, and that the promise she had crossed 3 states to collect did not exist. This was the particular terror that Elias Vorn had learned to exploit with a precision that, in retrospect, reads less like faith and more like engineering. He had understood from very early in his ministry, that the most dangerous moment for a closed, isolated, economically desperate community was not the moment of crisis itself, but the moment just before it, when people could still see the crisis coming and still had enough energy to either fight it or flee it. His entire pastoral method was organized around that specific window of time. He watched for it, he prepared for it, and in the winter of 1888, when the foreclosure notices began arriving, and the dead sky mornings began accumulating, and the people of Blackwood began looking at each other with the flat, hollow eyes of people who have started doing arithmetic on their own survival, Elias Vorn understood that his window had opened.
Elias Vorn was born in 1841 in Hardin County, Ohio, the 4th son of a flax farmer who beat his children with a leather strap and quoted Leviticus while he did it. This detail is not incidental. It is the entire architecture of what Vorn became. He was, by all surviving accounts, an exceptionally intelligent child, the kind of intelligence that, in a different family, a different economy, a different century, might have produced a physician, or a lawyer, or a scientist of some distinction. In the Vorn household, it produced something else entirely. A boy who learned very early that the most effective tool available to a person with no physical power over their circumstances was the ability to make another person believe something. His father could be managed, not resisted, not escaped, but managed through the careful selection of which biblical passages to recite at which moments. His older brothers could be redirected through the strategic introduction of blame onto absent parties. His mother, a woman so ground down by poverty and childbearing and violence that she had effectively ceased to be a person with preferences of her own, could be moved to protection through the precise calibration of vulnerability. Elias Vorn learned all of this before the age of 10. He learned it the way other children learn to read, not as a moral project, but as a survival mechanism, practiced daily, refined constantly, and eventually executed with an ease so complete it no longer felt like effort. He entered the seminary at Westerville, Ohio in 1859, at the age of 18, on a scholarship arranged by a local minister who described him in his letter of recommendation as possessing the most natural gift for spiritual persuasion he had encountered in 40 years of ministry. What the minister did not include in the letter, what he perhaps did not fully understand, was that Vorn's gift had nothing to do with spirituality and everything to do with observation. Vorn watched people. He cataloged their fears, their vanities, their private shames, their desperate need to believe that their suffering had meaning.
He was not cynical about this. That is the crucial and deeply unsettling distinction. He did not observe people in order to exploit them out of contempt. He observed them because he was genuinely, almost scientifically fascinated by the machinery of human belief, by the question of what precisely it took to make a person surrender their own judgment to another person's certainty. He was expelled from Westerville in 1861, for reasons that the seminary's records describe only as conduct unbecoming a minister of the gospel. The 3 students who filed the complaint against him refused then and later to describe what specifically had occurred. 2 of them left the seminary entirely within the year. The 3rd became a minister in eastern Ohio, married, had children, and in 1879, 18 years after the incident at Westerville, walked into the Scioto River on a Tuesday afternoon and did not walk out. Whether this is connected to Elias Vorn is unknown. It is, however, the kind of detail that accumulates around his life with a frequency that eventually stops feeling like coincidence. He arrived in Nebraska in 1880 as a self-ordained minister of no particular denomination, with a letter of character reference that no church authority has ever been able to trace to a verifiable source. He was 39 years old. He was thin, pale, possessed of an extraordinary stillness, the kind of physical composure that reads, depending on your relationship to the person displaying it, as either profound peace or the complete absence of anything that could be frightened. He found Blackwood 6 months after its founding. He offered his services as its minister. He was accepted with relief and without scrutiny, because on the Nebraska plains in 1880, a man who claimed to speak for God and seemed to believe it was not a luxury, he was a necessity. For 7 years he was, by nearly every account, an exemplary pastor. He was present at deaths and births. He arbitrated fairly. He worked alongside his congregation in the fields. He was not known to drink, not known to pursue women inappropriately, not known to enrich himself at the community's expense. He built trust with the patience and the precision of a man who understood that trust, once fully built, was the most load-bearing structure in existence. And then the dry years returned, and Corwin Falk came with his foreclosure papers, and Elias Vorn, in the dead sky winter of January 1888, finally revealed what he had spent 7 years building toward. The one event that made him monstrous was not a single event at all. It was the morning he woke up, looked at the community he had constructed around himself, looked at the sky that promised another destroying winter, and felt nothing. Not sorrow, not fear, not the weight of responsibility for 231 lives that depended on him. Nothing. And in that nothing, he found what he had been looking for since he was a boy in Hardin County, learning to manage his father's cruelty with carefully selected scripture. He found the answer to his life's central question. What does it take to make a person surrender their own judgment completely? The answer, he understood in that silent winter morning, was simple. You did not need to break them. You did not need to frighten them. You simply needed to become, in their minds, indistinguishable from the voice of God. And after 7 years in Blackwood, he had.
She had a scar that ran from the outer corner of her left eye to the hinge of her jaw, thin as a thread, pale as milk against her wind-darkened skin. And in the 7 years she had lived in Blackwood, Nebraska, not a single person had ever asked her how she got it. This was partly because the plains taught people early that certain questions were an indulgence they could not afford. But it was mostly because of the way Maren Sult carried herself, with a quality of self-containment so complete, so structurally load-bearing to her entire presence, that asking her a personal question felt less like curiosity and more like an act of trespass. She was 31 years old in January of 1888. She stood 5 feet and 4 inches tall, with the particular leanness of someone who had been working outdoors since childhood. Not the fashionable slenderness of parlor culture, but the functional, iron cable leanness of a body that had been asked to do hard things for a long time, and had simply reorganized itself around that requirement. Her hair was dark brown and cut short at the neck, which was unusual enough for a woman in Custer County in 1888, that it had been the subject of several pointed sermons from Elias Vorn on the topic of feminine propriety, sermons that Maren had sat through in the third pew from the front,
face perfectly composed, eyes fixed on the middle distance, the scar along her jaw catching the lamplight like a seam in old wood. She had come to Blackwood in 1881 from Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, with her husband, Dort Solt, a good-natured, broad-shouldered man of Dutch extraction who believed in the Homestead Act with the specific, uncomplicated faith of someone who had never been given a reason not to. They had filed on 160 acres 2 miles east of town. Dort had broken the sod, built the house, dug the well. Marin had done everything else: the planting, the preserving, the management of their small household economy, the careful arithmetic of survival that kept them solvent through the lean first years when the land was giving nothing back. By 1885 they had a daughter, Lena, who was 3 years old in the winter 1888, and who had her father's broad forehead and her mother's watchful, measuring eyes. Dort Solt died in the summer of 1886, struck by lightning on a clear afternoon when mending fence in the east field. He was dead before he hit the ground. Marin found him at dusk, still holding the fence wire, the grass around him scorched in a perfect circle as though the earth itself had been branded. She brought the horses in, fed them, put Lena to bed, sat down at the kitchen table, and did not move until morning. The neighbors who came the following day expecting to find her shattered, found instead a woman who was already calculating what came next, not because she was unfeeling, but because she understood, with a clarity that grief had burned down to pure function, that feeling it would have to wait. On the plains in 1886, it always had to wait. The wound that had made Marin Solt was not Dort's death, though that had deepened it. The wound was older. It was the scar itself and what had made it. She had been 19, still in Lancaster County, still in her father's house, when a man named Hendrik Claes, a minister as it happened, a well-respected elder of their congregation, had done to her a thing that she had reported to her father had reported to the church elders, and the church elders had responded to by suggesting, with great pastoral gentleness, that she consider what role her own conduct might have played in the misunderstanding. The scar had come from the window frame she had gone through when Claes threw her against it. The church elders had not asked about the scar either. What this history had given Marin, apart from the scar and the self-containment, and the deep, bone-level skepticism toward men who spoke with authority about the will of God, was a hidden strength that no one in Blackwood fully recognized. She could not be made to doubt her own perception. This sounds simple. It was not simple. On the Nebraska plains in 1888, in a community organized entirely around the principle that individual perception was subordinate to collective faith, the ability to look at something directly and call it what it was regardless of what the community was calling it, was as rare and as dangerous as carrying fire in your bare hands. Marin Solt had been carrying it for 12 years. Her secret, the thing that made her not purely good, the thing that she kept folded inside her like a letter she would never send, was this. She had known something was wrong with Elias Vorn for 2 years before January of 1888, and she had said nothing. She had watched him, catalogued him, measured the gap between what he said and what she observed in the faces of the people he said it to. She had seen the mechanism. She had understood the engineering. And she had stayed silent, partly because she had no proof and no ally, and partly, this is the part she could not forgive herself for, because as long as Vorn's hold on the community was keeping Corwin Falk's foreclosure machine temporarily at bay, as long as the church was the one institution standing between Blackwood's families and homelessness in a Nebraska winter, she had calculated that his particular poison was, for the moment, the lesser threat. She had made an arithmetic of other people's safety. She had been wrong.
He arrived in Blackwood on the 3rd of December, 1887, driving a wagon with a broken left wheel that he had repaired himself 3 miles outside of town, using wire and a piece of hickory he had cut from a dry creek bed. And this, the competence of it, the self-sufficiency of a man who solved his problems quietly and without asking for assistance, was the first thing Marin Solt noticed about him. He was 36 years old, Mexican by birth, Nebraskan by a decade of hard westward movement, and he carried in his face the particular weathering of someone who had spent years outdoors, in conditions that had not been designed with his survival in mind. He was not tall, 5'8", compact, with hands that were visibly, almost architecturally strong, the kind of hands that told you more about a man's history than his face did. His eyes were very dark and very steady, and they moved across a room the way Marin's did, not with the restless scanning of anxiety, but with the slow, methodical inventory of a person who had learned that the difference between safety and danger was almost always a detail that someone else had missed.
He had come to Blackwood to file on the last unclaimed homestead parcel in the area. 40 acres of poor ground on the town's western edge, flood-prone and stony, the kind of acreage that had been passed over by every family with better options. August Reyes did not have better options. He had, in the autumn of 1887, the $40 required for a filing fee, a sound horse, a repaired wagon, and a set of skills accumulated over years of working other men's land, carpentry, irrigation, the specific knowledge of how to coax yield from ground that had been written off. He had no family with him. He had come alone. His family background was a geography of losses. He had been born in Chihuahua in 1851, the son of a schoolteacher father, and a mother who made and sold embroidered cloth. His father had been killed in 1865, during a period of political violence that August had survived only because he had been sent to stay with relatives in Texas 2 weeks before the soldiers came. He had grown up in Texas understanding, with perfect practical clarity, that the law was not a structure built to protect people like him, that it was, in fact, a structure built specifically to process people like him into forms that were useful to people who were not like him. He had moved north through Kansas, working cattle drives, doing carpentry, saving money with a discipline that his co-workers found incomprehensible, until they understood that August Reyes was not saving money. He was saving latitude. He was accumulating the specific kind of freedom that only comes from owing no one anything. The wound beneath August's composed exterior was not a single event, but a specific absence. A woman named Clara Ibanez, whom he had met in Dodge City in 1882, and who had died of cholera in the summer of 1883, 7 months pregnant with what would have been their first child. He had buried her himself on the Kansas plain, dug the grave by hand in August heat, and then continued west, because continuing was the only direction that did not lead back through the place where she was no longer. He did not talk about Clara. He did not need to. She was present in him the way the scar was present on Marin Salt. Not hidden, not displayed, simply there. Structural, load-bearing, the thing that everything else had been built around. His hidden strength was that he was the best reader of physical space that Blackwood had ever seen. Not metaphorically, literally. He could walk into a building and understand, within minutes, its structural vulnerabilities, its exits, its sightlines, the places where a person could stand and not be seen. He had developed this skill over years of being in environments where the wrong position in a room could mean the wrong end of a confrontation, and it had calcified in him into something that operated below conscious thought. He simply always knew where the doors were, and which ones were actually locked. In January of 1888, in Blackwood, this skill would matter more than anyone could have predicted. His secret, his moral grayness, the thing that made him not purely good, was that he had been in Blackwood for 3 weeks before he understood what Elias Warren was doing, and his first instinct had not been to stop it. His first instinct had been to leave. He had packed his wagon on the night of December 28, 1887, intending to be gone before dawn. He had sat on the wagon seat in the dark with the horse shifting in the cold, and the dead sky pressing down from the northwest, and he had run the arithmetic the same way Marin had, and come to the same conclusion she had, that it was not his community, not his problem, not his fight. He held that thought for approximately 40 minutes. Then he had unhitched the horse, gone back inside, and begun, very carefully and very quietly, to watch Elias Warren. He could not have explained, if asked, why he stayed. The truth, the real truth, the one he did not examine too closely, was that Blackwood reminded him of Clara. Not the town itself, not any one person in it, but the specific quality of its vulnerability, the way it had organized itself around a belief that was slowly becoming a trap, the way the people in it loved their lives on the plains with a stubborn, almost aggressive sincerity that made them, in their openness, easy to destroy. Clara had been like that. Clara had been so entirely, so generously present in the world that she had not seen the thing coming that killed her until it was already inside her. August Reyes had not been able to save Clara. He was not certain he could save Blackwood, but he stayed. The moment he and Marin Salt realized their goals aligned was not a conversation. It was a look, exchanged across the length of the Blackwood Church on the evening of January 8, 1888, during the service at which Elias Warren first introduced, obliquely and with the full apparatus of his pastoral authority, the concept he would spend the next 3 days elaborating into an instruction. Marin had been watching Warren's face. August had been watching the congregation's. They each looked away from what they were watching at precisely the same moment, and they looked directly at each other.
and what passed between them in that fraction of a second was not attraction, not recognition in the romantic sense, but something rarer and more functional than either of those things. The mutual confirmation that each of them was not alone in seeing what they were seeing, and that they were therefore both, unambiguously, in very serious danger.
They did not speak after the service on January 8th. Speaking would have been noticed. In Blackwood in the winter of 1888, every social interaction occurred within the sight or hearing of someone else, because the town was small and the cold kept people indoors, and indoors meant proximity, and proximity in a community organized around collective faith meant that deviation from the expected, an unusual pairing, a whispered exchange, a look that lasted 3 seconds longer than friendliness required, was registered, catalogued, and eventually delivered to Elias Vorney in the form of the small, well-intentioned reports that his congregation had been trained, over 7 years, to understand as acts of spiritual care rather than surveillance. He had built this system gradually, introducing it first as an encouragement to look out for neighbors in distress, then refining it, slowly, sermon by sermon, into something more precise, a community-wide practice of mutual observation that he framed as love and that functioned as intelligence. By January of 1888, there was almost no private space left in Blackwood. Almost. Marin had known about the one exception for 2 years. It was the mill, specifically the grain storage room at the mill's eastern end, which shared a wall with the attached stable and was therefore always loud enough with animal noise and the creaking of the building in the wind to make it impossible to hear a conversation from outside. The mill's owner, a widower named Pratt, had died in November of 1887, and the building had been sitting unused since then, its lock rusted open, its interior cold and dark, and smelling of old grain and horse, and the particular mineral silence of a space that had been abandoned mid-use. Marin had gone there twice in the past year simply to think, simply to be in a space where no one was watching, and she had told no one about it, which meant it was, as far as she knew, the only place in Blackwood where 2 people could speak without being reported. She left a note for August Reyes on the morning of January 9th, tucked beneath the split rail of the fence at the eastern edge of his claimed property, a fence that bordered the path she walked each morning to collect water from the town's shared well, so that stopping there required no explanation if anyone was watching. The note said only, "Mill, tonight, 1 hour after the lamp in the church goes dark." She did not sign it. She did not need to. He came. He was there before her, which she had not expected, standing against the far wall of the grain room with his back to the corner so that he could see both the door and the window from a single position, and she recognized this immediately for what it was, not aggression, not dominance, but the specific spatial arrangement of a person who had spent years making sure no one could come at them from behind, and something in her chest eased fractionally, the way it sometimes does when you encounter a person whose damage rhymes with your own. She said, "I know what he is doing." He said, "How long have you known?" It was not a question. She answered it anyway. 2 years. She paused, and then because he was not visibly judging her for those 2 years of silence, she said, "I thought he was stable. I thought the community needed the stability more than it needed the truth. I was wrong." He was quiet for a moment. The stable wall creaked. A horse shifted its weight. Then he said, "I have been watching him for 3 weeks. I think the foreclosure notices are what moved the timeline. Falk's last visit was in July. He is due back in January. Vorney knows that when Falk arrives, the community's faith in God's protection of Blackwood stops being abstract theology and starts being a specific, testable claim that 64 simultaneous foreclosures will immediately falsify. He cannot allow the test to occur." Marin looked at him across the dark of the grain room. She said, "He is going to move before Falk arrives." August said, "I believe he already has." The silence after that was the particular silence of 2 people adjusting to the weight of a conclusion they had each been approaching from different directions and had now, together, fully arrived at. She did not trust him yet. She wanted to. She did not. The first test came the following morning, January 10th, and it was Marin who administered it, though August never knew it had been a test until much later. She told him at their second meeting at the mill on the night of the 9th that she had found something in Vorney's church, a document, folded inside the back cover of the pastor's personal Bible, which she had been asked to clean and return to the pulpit after the previous week's service, and which she had opened with the specific cold-blooded curiosity of a woman who had decided that the time for ethical restraint had passed. The document was a list of names, all 231 residents of Blackwood, organized not alphabetically but in a sequence she could not immediately identify, with small notations beside each name in Vorney's cramped, precise handwriting,
notations in a shorthand she did not fully recognize but could partially decode. She had memorized it. She recited it to August from memory, 12 names with their notations, and watched his face while she did it. What she was testing was not whether he recognized the names. She was testing whether he would tell her what the notations meant if he knew, or whether he would deflect, minimize, or redirect the 3 behavioral signatures she had learned, over 12 years of careful observation, to associate with men who understood more than they were saying. August listened to all 12 names and their notations without interrupting. Then he was quiet for 4 seconds. She counted, and then he said, "The sequence is geographic, north to south, from the town cemetery to the church, and the notations are resistance assessments. He has categorized everyone in Blackwood by how likely they are to refuse a direct instruction." She had not known that. She had suspected something like it, but had not known it. The fact that he had decoded it immediately and had told him immediately, without any visible calculation about whether telling her was strategically advantageous, was the data point she had been waiting for. It did not make her trust him completely. It made her trust him enough to continue. The second moment of trust came 3 days later, on the evening of January 11th, the day Vorney made his announcement from the church steps, when August did something that required him to expose himself to significant personal risk on behalf of a child he had no relationship with. Marin's daughter Lena had been inside the church when Vorney made his announcement, attending the children's instruction session that met on Wednesday afternoons, and when Marin arrived at the church steps to hear Vorney's voice carrying across the cold air, with that particular quality of resonant, unhurried certainty that she had learned to recognize as his most dangerous register, her first thought was not for herself but for Lena inside, being prepared. August had arrived at the church from the opposite direction 30 seconds before Marin, had immediately assessed the situation, had walked directly inside, past the 2 men standing at the door whom Vorney had stationed there, past the assembled adults listening with their faces arranged in the specific expression of people trying to feel what they had been told they should feel, and had walked to the children's room at the back of the building, taken Lena by the hand, and walked back out through a side door and across the frozen yard to Marin's house, where he left the child inside with the door latched and a chair wedged against it, and then walked back to the church as though he had simply needed a moment of air, and stood in the small crowd, and listened, and did not look at Marin when she arrived. It had taken him 4 minutes. It had put him in direct and visible defiance of 2 of Vorney's chosen men, neither of whom had stopped him, partly because they had not fully understood what was happening, and partly because August Reyes had the specific quality of a man in purposeful motion that tends to simply part crowds rather than provoke them. But the risk had been real, and he had taken it for Lena without being asked, and when Marin understood what he had done, she felt something shift in her chest that was not quite gratitude and not quite grief, but lived somewhere in the neighborhood of both. The third moment, the one that completed the architecture of trust between them, occurred on the night of January 12th, when Vorney sent a man named Geddes to Marin's house to inquire with pastoral gentleness why she and her daughter had not joined the community's first preparatory gathering that afternoon. August had seen Geddes leave the church and had taken a route through the back field that arrived at Marin's door 2 minutes before Geddes knocked. He did not hide. He simply sat at her kitchen table with a cup of water and Lena on the bench beside him, and when Marin opened a door to Geddes, the tableau was so domestic, so unremarkable, a neighbor, a child, a kitchen, that Geddes delivered his inquiry, received Marin's calm explanation that Lena had a cough and she had judged it unwise to bring her into the cold, noted the presence of August with a look that was assessing but not yet suspicious, and left. After he was gone, Marin latched the door and turned around and looked at August for a long moment and said, "You are going to tell me something now that I am not going to like." He said, "Yes." She said, "Tell me."
What August Reyes told Marin Solt on the night of January 12, 1888, in her kitchen, with her daughter asleep on the bench, and the dead sky pressing down outside, and the temperature dropping toward the numbers that killed livestock, was this. He had met Elias Vorn before. Not in Blackwood, not in Nebraska. In a small farming settlement in eastern Kansas, in the autumn of 1879, 8 years earlier, where Vorn had been operating under a different name, a settlement called Harrow Creek that no longer existed, because in the late winter of 1880, approximately 60 of its residents had walked into a frozen river on the instructions of their minister, and 31 of them had not come back out. August had been working a cattle drive that passed within 4 miles of Harrow Creek in the spring of 1880, and he had seen the aftermath. Not the deaths themselves, which had occurred 4 months earlier, but the empty houses, the open doors, the tables still set for meals that had never been eaten. He had asked questions. He had been told, by the single family that had refused to go into the river and had therefore survived to describe what had happened, that the minister's name was Caleb Marsh. He had memorized the face he was shown in a daguerreotype held by the surviving family. He had never reported it, because to whom would he have reported it? The county sheriff, who operated in a jurisdiction that contained no brown-skinned men in the category of credible witnesses,
the territorial court that processed his kind as labor rather than as people with testimony. He had carried it instead, the way he carried everything, folded inside him, waiting. When he arrived in Blackwood 3 weeks ago and first saw Elias Warren standing on the church steps, he had recognized the face immediately. The name was different. The state was different. The methodology, as far as he could determine, was identical. Harrow Creek had been smaller, the community less established, the process faster. Blackwood was larger, more rooted, more heavily invested in its own survival, and so Vaughan had spent 7 years instead of 2 building the required architecture of trust. But the destination, August believed, was the same. The frozen river had become, here, the blizzard. The instruction to walk in had become, here, the instruction to walk north. The outcome, if they did not stop it, would be the same 31 dead becoming 219. Marin sat with this for a long time. The fire burned low. Lena breathed in her sleep. Finally, Marin said, "You knew this when you arrived. You knew on December 3rd what he was." August said, "Yes." She said, "And you packed your wagon on December 28th to leave." He did not deny it. She said, "What stopped you?" He was quiet. She said, "I need to know." He said, "I stayed because I could not carry another Harrow Creek." She looked at the scar along her jaw in the reflection of the dark window for a moment, and then she looked back at him and said, "Then we are agreed on what has to happen." He said, "We are, but you need to understand something before we go further." She said, "Tell me." He said, "Vaughan is planning to move tomorrow." The announcement was not the beginning, it was the last step. He has been preparing this community for this moment for 2 years. We do not have the luxury of a careful plan. We have until morning. If you are still watching, if you have stayed with Marin in August this far into the dark, drop a 777 in the comments right now. I want to know who is still with us, because what comes next is the part of this story that the Custer County records sealed in 1889 and did not unseal for 60 years. And when you understand why they sealed it, you will understand why some truths are not buried by accident. What they devised in the next 3 hours, at Marin's kitchen table with the wind pressing against the walls like something that wanted in, was not an elegant plan. It was a plan built from the materials available, which were limited, and which included no weapons, no allies they were certain of, no legal authority, and no time. The first element was Lena. August would take her before dawn to the Hendricks farm, 4 miles south. The one family in Blackwood that Marin knew with certainty was not under Vaughan's influence, because old Ida Hendricks had stopped attending church in 1885 after Vaughan had suggested, with pastoral gentleness, that her grief over her dead husband was a spiritual deficiency rather than a human response to loss, and Ida had looked at him with the specific expression of a woman who had outlived 4 Nebraska winters and was not interested in being managed, and had walked out and never returned. Lena would be safe there. Lena would be outside the radius of whatever was coming. The second element was the list. Marin had memorized it. 231 names, sequenced north to south, annotated by resistance level. The 14 people Vaughan had marked with the notation she and August had decoded as high resistance were their targets. These were the people most likely to be persuaded. These were the people, if they could be reached and convinced in the hours before dawn, who might in turn persuade others. The 2 seeds of doubt that neither of them spoke aloud but both of them felt were these. First, that 7 years of Vaughan's pastoral engineering might have built walls in people's minds that even the truth could not breach in a single night, that the community's faith in him might be so structurally integral to their survival that removing it, even with evidence, might cause a different kind of collapse. And second, the darker doubt, the one that sat at the bottom of everything, that Vaughan already knew they were moving against him, that Geddes had not been fooled by the kitchen tableau, that the note under the fence rail had been found, that somewhere in the 7 years of careful architecture that Vaughan had built around this community, he had already built something around them.
They separated at 2 in the morning on January 13th, 1888, into a cold so absolute it had a texture, a dry, crystalline resistance against the skin of the face that felt less like temperature and more like the air itself had hardened into something that did not, to show the first faint bruising that meant the storm Vorna had been watching and waiting for was now less than 12 hours away. Her first stop was the Brauer house. Otto and Liesel Brauer, German immigrants in their mid-40s, marked on Vorna's list with the highest resistance notation. Otto had lost 2 sons to a diphtheria outbreak in 1885 and had never fully returned to the uncomplicated faith he'd had before it, attending services with the dutiful, hollow regularity of a man going through motions he no longer believed in but could not afford to abandon publicly. Marin knocked twice, Lowe and Ike.
the specific knock she and Otto had established 2 years ago, when she had been the one to sit with him through the night his second son died, when she had been the one whose presence he had needed and whose silence he had trusted. He opened the door within 30 seconds, which meant he had not been sleeping, which meant the preparatory gatherings of the previous 2 days had left him in the same state of sleepless, unprocessed dread that she had been in since January 8th. She told him everything in 11 minutes, standing in his doorway with the cold pushing past them both into the warm interior of his house, where Liesl sat upright in a chair by the fire, watching Marin's face with the focused attention of a woman taking inventory of whether she should be frightened. Marin told them about Harrow Creek. She told them about the list and what the notations meant. She told them about the frozen river and the 31 dead, and the face that August had recognized. She did not soften any of it, and she did not qualify any of it, and she spoke in the same level, unhurried voice she used for everything, because she had learned a long time ago that the voice that convinces people of difficult truths is not the voice of urgency, but the voice of someone who has already absorbed the difficulty and is simply reporting its coordinates. Otto Brauer said nothing for a long moment after she finished. Then he said, "I knew something was wrong. I have known since November. I did not know what it was." He looked at his wife. Liesl had already stood up and was moving toward the back of the house where their coats hung. Otto said to Marin, "Who else?" She gave him 4 names, his closest neighbors, people he could reach without crossing the main road that ran past the church. He nodded. He took his coat. They went. The first 3 hours moved with a momentum that felt, in retrospect, almost too clean, the kind of early success that the plains had taught Marin to distrust on principle, because the plains did not give you easy beginnings without hiding something complicated inside them. By 4 in the morning she had reached 9 of her 14 high-resistance targets. 7 had believed her immediately, or had believed her enough, which in this context was the same thing. 2 had not answered their doors. 1 had answered and listened and then closed the door in her face without a word, and she had stood for a moment in the dark outside his house and felt the first cold edge of the fear she had been keeping carefully outside her operational thinking, and then she had moved on, because moving on was the only direction available. The thing that went wrong, the minor wrongness that she recognized as foreshadowing only later, was a lamp, in the church. At 4:17 in the morning, when Marin was crossing the far edge of the churchyard on her way to the 10th name on her list, she saw a light moving inside the building, not the fixed light of an oil lamp left burning, but the moving light of someone carrying one, passing behind the narrow windows of the nave with the slow, deliberate pace of someone who was not looking for something but checking on something. She stopped. She watched the light-completed circuit of the building's interior. She watched it come to rest, stationary, in the window of the small room behind the pulpit that served as Vorna's private study. She stood in the dark and the cold outside the churchyard fence, and she watched that stationary light for 90 seconds, and then she turned and continued to her 10th name, and did not allow herself to think about what the light meant until she had finished what she had come to do. She thought about it on the way back. By then it was nearly 5 in the morning, and the northwestern horizon had gone from bruised to actively, visibly threatening, a wall of clouds so dark it was nearly purple, moving south with a speed that experienced plains people recognized as the specific velocity of a storm that was not going to be a storm so much as an erasure. The light in Vorna's study was still burning. It had not moved. He had not been asleep. He had been waiting.
August returned from the Hendricks farm at 5:40 in the morning, having confirmed that Lena was inside, and Ida Hendricks was awake and armed, with the specific, granite-faced practicality of an old Nebraska woman who had been told that something terrible was happening, and had responded by putting water on to boil and loading the rifle she kept above the kitchen door. He found Marin at the mill, their agreed return point, and she told him about the lamp and the 11 minutes of silence that followed, while they both stood in the freezing dark of the grain room and recalibrated. Then August told her what he had found on his way back from the Hendricks farm, and the lamp became the smaller of their 2 problems. He had taken the Northfield route back to town, skirting the cemetery, and he had found, at the cemetery's northern edge, where Blackwood ended and the open plain began, a structure he had not seen before. Not a building, not a marker, a line. Driven into the frozen earth at intervals of approximately 10 feet, running east to west across the full width of the field for as far as he could see in the dark, were wooden stakes, each one roughly 3 feet high, each one connected to the next by a length of thin rope that had been painted white. In the darkness and the coming snow, the rope would be nearly invisible against the ground. In a blizzard,
In the specific, annihilating, zero-visibility blizzard that was now 3 hours away at most, the painted rope would be completely invisible. The stakes themselves, driven deep and set firm, would still be standing. You would not see them until you had already walked past them. You would not be able to find your way back. This was not a spontaneous religious instruction. This was infrastructure. This had been built over days, possibly weeks, by someone who knew exactly what was coming and exactly what he intended to do with it. The stakes had been placed with precision. They began at the exact point where the town ended and the open plain began, at the exact place where a person walking north, following an instruction they believed was divine, would pass from the structured world into the unstructured one. The white rope was not a guide. It was a marker of the point of no return, painted to disappear into the conditions that would be present when it was needed. Marin looked at August when he finished describing it and said, "How many graves are in the cemetery?" He said, 43. She said, "How many stakes?" He said he had counted 31 on the east end alone before the dark it made counting impossible. She said, "He has done this before." He said, "Yes." She said, "Harrow Creek." He said, "The river there had a current. It did the work for him. Here, he needs the storm to do it. And the storm is coming regardless of anything we do. The question is how many people are going to walk into it." What they had uncovered was not just a plan. It was a system, refined, apparently, over at least 2 iterations, adjusted for the specific geography of Blackwood, timed to coincide with a natural event that Vorn had been watching the sky for with the patience of a man who understood that the plains would eventually provide him the instrument he needed. He had not chosen January for theological reasons. He had chosen it because January in Nebraska was when the blizzards came, and a blizzard on the open plain was the most efficient mechanism available for the permanent disappearance of a large number of people in a way that would, in 1888, with the nearest law enforcement 40 miles away on an impassable road, look like tragedy rather than murder. It would look like the frontier doing what the frontier did. It would look like God failing to protect the faithful, which was a story that the frontier told about itself constantly and that no one in authority would have reason to investigate. There was one more thing. In the ground near the easternmost stake, August had found a tin box sealed with wax, buried approximately 6 inches down in earth that had been recently disturbed. He had opened it. Inside was a single document, a deed made out in Corwin Falk's name, transferring ownership of all 64 mortgaged properties in Blackwood to the Ketham Land and Agricultural Credit Company and settlement of outstanding debts. The deed was dated January 15, 1888, 2 days in the future. It was signed by Falk. It was also signed as witnessing party by Elias Vorn. The notary seal was from Broken Bow. Vorn and Falk were not adversaries. They had never been adversaries. The entire performance of the church as protector against the creditor, 7 years of pastoral positioning, 7 years of being the one institution standing between the community and dispossession, had been a stage set. Falk had been Vorn's partner from the beginning, or close enough to it to make no practical difference. The foreclosures were not what Vorn was protecting the community from. The foreclosures were the mechanism by which Vorn ensured that when the community walked north into the blizzard, there would be no living heirs to contest the property transfer. 219 dead, 64 properties cleared of claim, 1 deed pre-signed, buried in the frozen ground, and waiting for the snow to finish its work. They stood in the grain room with the deed between them and the storm growing on the horizon and the lamp still burning in Vorn's study window, and neither of them spoke for a very long time.
The first death was not one they caused. It was one they witnessed. And it was the death that made everything that followed both inevitable, and in some part of themselves they would spend years afterward refusing to examine, possible. His name was Silas Prout. He was 64 years old, a widower, a carpenter, a gentle and largely silent man who had built half the houses in Blackwood, and who appeared on Vorn's list with a resistance notation that Marin and August had decoded as moderate, a man who doubted but could not bring himself to act on the doubt. He was one of the 2 who had not answered his door when Marin came. She had not known whether he was absent or simply unwilling to open to a knock at 3 in the morning, and she had moved on and added him to the mental category of uncertain and continued working. What she had not known and could not have known was that Silas Prout had answered a different knock 30 minutes before hers, a knock from one of Vorn's chosen men, who had delivered a private pastoral message to Silas that Vorn had been, apparently, preparing for months. What the message contained was never established with certainty because Silas Prout did not survive to describe it. What August and Marin saw from the window of the grain room at 6:15 in the morning was Silas Prout walking north across the churchyard in his work clothes without a coat, moving with the specific, deliberate, unhurried pace of a man following an instruction he had decided to obey, and behind him at a distance of 30 feet, Vorn standing on the church steps watching him go. The storm was now close enough that the air had the quality of held breath, the flat, pressurized stillness that precedes a plains blizzard,
when the temperature drops 8 degrees in 20 minutes and the light goes the color of old pewter. Maren moved toward the door. August put his hand on her arm. She looked at him. He shook his head. Not cruelty, not indifference, but the specific calculation of a man who understood that if they broke cover now, for Silas Prout, who was 64 and had already made his decision, and was already 40 feet from the cemetery's northern edge and moving steadily, they would lose every remaining person they had not yet reached. She understood this. She stood at the window and watched Silas Prout walk north until the gray morning swallowed him. She did not look away. She believed correctly that she owed him that. She was still watching the place where he had disappeared when the first flakes of the blizzard arrived, small and horizontal and businesslike, and began to accumulate against the window pane. The second death was calculated. It was theirs, and it was necessary in the way that certain terrible things are necessary, not in the sense that no other option existed, but in the sense that every other option had been examined and found to lead to a worse place. Corwin Falk arrived in Blackwood at 7 in the morning on January 13, 1888, on schedule, as he arrived every January, driving a 2-horse buggy from Broken Bow with a leather satchel full of foreclosure documents on the seat beside him, and the specific expression of a man who expected the day's business to be unpleasant, and had long since made his peace with that. He did not know about the blizzard's timing, or if he knew, he had calculated that he would be inside and finished and on his way back before the worst of it arrived, which was the kind of calculation that men who have never had to survive a Nebraska winter make about Nebraska winters. He pulled his buggy up to the church, which was the agreed meeting point, and sat for a moment adjusting his coat, and then he stepped down into the white air and walked toward the church steps. August Reyes was waiting for him in the space between the church's sidewall and the attached storage shed, a shadow among shadows, standing with his back to the wall in the position that used the structure to eliminate all approach angles except the one he was watching. He had the deed from the tin box in his coat pocket. He was not carrying a weapon. He did not need one for what he was about to do, because what he was about to do was show Corwin Falk the deed, explain to him precisely and without embellishment what it evidenced, and present him with a choice. The choice was this. Falk could walk into that church and complete his participation in the death of 231 people, at the end of which he would have 64 parcels of Nebraska farmland worth approximately $14,000 and the permanent company of what he had done. Or he could take his buggy south, now, in the next 5 minutes, back to Broken Bow, and file a statement with the county sheriff identifying Elias Vaughan by name and by deed as an accessory to mass murder across 2 states, the evidence for which was the box and its contents, and the stakes in the ground at the cemetery's northern edge, and August Reyes himself as a witness to Harrow Creek. Falk listened to all of this. He was a man in his 50s, heavy-featured, with the flat affect of someone who had spent decades making decisions he preferred not to feel. He looked at the deed. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You have no standing. You are nobody. Your testimony means nothing in any court in this territory." August said, "I know that, which is why I have written everything down and given it to a party who will deliver it to the Omaha Daily Bee if I am not in Broken Bow by February 1st. He had not done this. He was doing what Maren had taught him in 11 minutes in a doorway at 3 in the morning, presenting a truth in the voice of someone who has already absorbed it, so that it sounds like a report rather than a bluff. Falk looked at him for a long, assessing moment. Then Falk turned and walked back to his buggy and drove south into the coming storm and did not look back. He was not seen in Custer County again. Whether August believed Falk would go to the sheriff was a question he and Maren did not discuss until years later. The answer he eventually gave her was no. "I did not think he would go to the sheriff. I thought he would go somewhere safe and wait to see which way it fell. I needed him out of the building. He was out of the building." But Falk had been in the churchyard for 3.5 minutes, and Vaughan had been watching from his study window, and the lamp that had been burning in that window since before 4 in the morning went out at 7:14 precisely, and August and Maren both understood what the extinguishing of that lamp meant. Vaughan had moved to the next stage. He was no longer waiting. He was beginning. The third death was the one that the Custer County records sealed, the one that no official document from 1888 describes directly, the one that the 2 surviving witnesses, Maren Solt and August Reyes, gave different accounts of, in different places, in different years, with the specific, careful inconsistency of 2 people who had agreed on what to say and were each independently being precise about which parts of the truth that agreement covered. At 7:40 in the morning on January 13, 1888, with the blizzard now fully arrived, and the visibility in Blackwood reduced to approximately 15 feet, and the temperature at -14 degrees Fahrenheit, and the main road to Broken Bow already buried under 8 inches of new snow, Maren Solt walked into the Church of the Redeemed Prairie and sat down in the 3rd pew from the front. The church was full. 163 people. The remainder of Blackwood's population, minus the 8 who had already begun walking north, minus the 14 that Maren had reached in the night, minus Lena at the Hendricks farm, minus the 2 who had not answered their doors, were seated in the pews in their winter clothes with the specific, wide-eyed, slightly dislocated expression of people in an altered state that was not quite trance and not quite ordinary consciousness, but something in between. Vaughan was at the pulpit. He was speaking. His voice had the quality it had at its most dangerous, unhurried, resonant, so entirely without visible effort that it sounded less like a man talking and more like a room thinking out loud. Maren sat down. She put her hands in her lap. She looked at the scar in her reflection in the dark window to her left.
and then she looked at Elias Vorn, and he looked back at her, and his voice did not pause or falter, and his face did not change, but something moved behind his eyes, something that recognized her and recognized what she was there to do, and was in the specific and terrible way of a man who has spent decades studying human behavior, almost curious about how she intended to do it. She opened her mouth. She said in a voice that was not loud but was perfectly, surgically clear in the resonant space of the wooden church, "His name is Caleb Marsh. He killed 31 people in Harrow Creek, Kansas in the winter of 1880. I have the deed. I have the stakes. I have a witness." And then she set the deed from the tin box on the pew beside her, and she waited. What followed was not an immediate eruption. It was something slower and more complicated and ultimately more devastating than that. The specific sound of a community's foundational architecture beginning, load-bearing beam by load-bearing beam, to fail. It was the sound of 163 people exhaling something they had been holding for a very long time. Vorn stepped down from the pulpit. He walked toward her. He was almost at the third pew when the door at the back of the church opened and August Reyes walked in from the blizzard with frost on his coat and the tin box in his hand, and the specific expression of a man who has already done his arithmetic and is here to collect. And the door opened again, and Otto Brower came in, and behind her Liesel, and behind her 6 of the people Mering had reached in the night, and behind them others still, and Elias Vorn stopped walking. He stood in the aisle of his church with the blizzard screaming outside, and 200 years of accumulated human certainty collapsing in the room around him, and he looked at Maren Solt with the scar along her jaw, and the deed on the pew beside her, and the full, terrible weight of Harrow Creek arriving in the room, and said, in a voice that was very quiet, and almost human, "I gave them meaning. Whatever you believe about me, I gave them meaning." She looked back at him and said, "Silas Prout is in that field." He had nothing to say to that.
What follows is the account that Maren Solt transcribed from memory in the spring of 1891, 3 years after the events at Blackwood, in a document that was discovered inside the lining of a traveling trunk in a Broken Bow boarding house in 1923, and subsequently acquired by a private collector whose estate has never been fully inventoried. It is the only first-hand record of Elias Vorn speaking in his own voice about what he did and why he did it. It was not delivered as a confession. It was delivered as an explanation, which is a different thing entirely, and the difference matters. He spoke for approximately 20 minutes, standing at the front of his church with the blizzard outside, and Harlan Kress and his 2 men at the back, and 163 Blackwood residents in the pews between them. And his voice had, throughout, the quality she had always found most disturbing about it, the quality of a man who has thought about something so thoroughly and for so long that he has passed through doubt and out the other side, into a place where certainty lives that has nothing to do with evidence. He said, "You want to understand what I am. I have spent 30 years watching people decide what I am, and I have found that they are almost always wrong in the same direction. They reach for the simple explanation, greed, madness, cruelty, because the simple explanation is the one that lets them place me outside the boundary of what human beings are capable of. And once I am outside that boundary, they can stop being troubled by the question of why what I do works, why it has always worked, why it worked in Harrow Creek, and why it was working here until this morning. That question, why it works, is the one they never want to answer, because the answer implicates them. What you call manipulation, I call ministry. I know you find that obscene. I know you are sitting in those pews right now, reconstructing 7 years of my presence in your lives, and replacing every memory of comfort with suspicion, every moment of pastoral care with the vocabulary of predation. I know because I have watched people do it before, and I understand the mechanism. It is the mind protecting itself from the unbearable knowledge that it chose this, that it was not done to you, that you came to me freely, year after year, because what I offered you was something that the plains and the drought and the foreclosure notices and the dead children in the cemetery could not offer you, which was meaning, a reason, a framework in which your suffering was not random and your endurance was not pointless, and your lives on this broken ground were part of a design that intended something for you beyond the grave you were all moving toward at different speeds. I did not invent that need. I did not create it or engineer it or install it in you. It was there before I arrived. It has been there in every human community since before recorded history. The need to believe that suffering is instructive rather than merely mechanical. What I did was find it and use it, the way a millwright finds a river and uses it. And I will not apologize for the efficiency of the mechanism, because the river does not apologize for the wheel. What happened in Harrow Creek, I see the name on your faces. I see the man in the back of the room who brought it here. Let me tell you what happened in Harrow Creek, in my own words, because the account he carries is the account of survivors,
and survivors are always the ones who refused, and the ones who refuse always describe the thing they refused as catastrophe, because the alternative is to admit that the 31 people who walked into that river did so because on some level, at the bottom of everything, they had decided they were done. Not because I told them to, because I gave them a context in which the decision they had already made, quietly, in the private arithmetic of their own suffering, was permitted, was sanctified, was transformed from surrender into something that looked, from the inside, like choice. I gave them the word for what they already wanted to do. That is all a minister ever does. Here in Blackwood, I want you to hear this clearly, because it is the thing that will trouble you longest. I was not wrong about the foreclosures. Falk was going to take 64 properties. Most of the families in this room were going to be homeless in a Nebraskan winter, with no road south and no money, and no alternatives that I could see, and none that you could see either, because you had already done the arithmetic and arrived at the same destination I had. The difference between you and the 31 in Harrow Creek was not that you had more hope, it was that you had not yet been given permission to stop pretending that you did. I was preparing to give you that permission. I was preparing to give your ending a shape, a liturgy, something that would make the cold feel, in the last minutes of it, like arrival rather than erasure. You will say, that is monstrous. I know you will say that. I am not arguing against the word. I am only pointing out that the alternative, the one that man in the back of the room and the woman with the scar have given you this morning, is this: survival. Which means you walk out of this church into a blizzard that is real regardless of anything I planned, and the road to Broken Bow is buried, and Falk's partners in Omaha still hold your paper, and the children in the cemetery are still there, and the ground is still frozen, and the meaning I gave you for 7 years is now a story you will tell about a monster, which means you are back where you were before I arrived, suffering randomly, on a plane that does not care, without a reason. I gave you a reason. I am the only one in this room who ever gave you a reason. He paused. The blizzard pressed against the walls. One of the women in the middle pews was weeping quietly, not in distress, or not only in distress, but with the specific helpless tears of someone who has just heard something they will spend the rest of their life wishing they had not understood. Vornay looked across the congregation one final time, and for a moment, for one brief, completely unguarded moment, something in his face was not the face of a predator or a manipulator or a man without conscience. It was the face of a person who had spent 30 years believing something terrible, and had never once, in all that time, found sufficient evidence to stop. He said quietly, almost to himself, I have never been wrong about the need, only perhaps about the remedy. Then he looked at Harlan Kress at the back of the room, and the unguarded moment closed, and he was whatever he was again.
Harlan Kress was not from the Nebraska Territorial Administration. This became clear within 4 minutes of his announcement, as Otto Brower, who had, in his previous life in Ohio, worked as a county clerk, and possessed the specific, useful knowledge of a man who had spent years handling official documents, looked at the administrative seal on the paper Kress had produced, and said in a flat, carrying voice that cut through the noise of the blizzard and the congregation's distress with the precision of a blade, "That seal is from 1884. The Territorial Administration changed its seal in 1886. Everyone in the relevant offices knew this. Kress knew they would know it if they looked. He had not expected anyone to look. He was, as August had suspected from the moment he walked in, a fixer, a private agent dispatched, most likely from Omaha, most likely by the larger financial apparatus of which Chatham Land was only one part, to contain the situation before it produced the kind of public record that expensive lawyers could not subsequently manage. He was there for the deed and the tin box. He was there to ensure that Vaughn's arrangement with Falk remained a private business matter rather than a criminal one. He was not there to help the people of Blackwood. He was there to ensure that what happened to them happened quietly, without documentation, in a way that the relevant parties in Omaha could subsequently describe as tragedy. When Otto called the seal, Kress's composure held for approximately 3 seconds. Then he looked at the two large men, and something passed between them in the way of men who have worked together long enough to communicate in fractions of movement, and the larger of the two began moving toward the front of the church where the deed and the tin box were, and August moved at the same moment from the opposite direction. What followed in the next 90 seconds was not a fight in the cinematic sense. It was not organized or choreographed or in any way aesthetically coherent. It was the specific chaos of a large number of frightened people in a confined space suddenly understanding that the two large men in their church were not authority and never had been. It was Otto Brower's voice carrying above the noise. It was Liesl Brower pulling the tin box from the larger man's hands with the ferocious economic grip of a woman who had decided what mattered and was not going to negotiate about it. It was August taking the position he had identified from the moment he walked in.
the structural pillar between the second and third pews, the one that gave him a sightline to both doors, and from that position managing the space with the quiet, unshowy competence of someone who had been in enough physical confrontations to understand that the outcome is usually determined by who stays calm longest. Cress made for the side door. The door opened into the blizzard. He was outside for 40 seconds. When he came back in, because 40 seconds in a Nebraska blizzard at -14 degrees wearing a business coat from Omaha is sufficient to recalibrate most men's priorities, Otto Brower was standing at the door, and behind him were 11 people, and behind them was the sound of a community that had been operating at the edge of disillusion for 2 years, suddenly discovering that it had, after all, a center. Vorn had not moved from the front of the church. He stood beside the pulpit with the stillness he had always had, watching the reorganization of the room with the expression of a man watching something he had built being taken apart, not with grief exactly, and not with anger, but with the distant, almost scholarly attention of someone observing a process that confirms a theory. He looked at Marin, who had been watching him throughout, and he said, "What will you do with me?" It was not a frightened question. It was a genuine one. He was, she thought, actually curious. She said, "That is not my decision." He said, "It is, though. The law you can reach is 40 miles south on a buried road. The storm will last 3 to 4 days by my estimate, and I know this sky better than anyone in this room. Whatever happens to me will happen here, in this building, decided by the people in these pews, which means it will be decided by you, because you are the only one in this room they will listen to." He paused. He said, "That is a great deal of power for a woman who came here to take power away from someone who had too much of it." She looked at him for a long moment. The scar along her jaw was pale in the gray light coming through the church windows. She said, "Sit down, Elias." He sat. The reckoning with Harlan Cress and his 2 men was complicated by the blizzard in the way that all justice on the Nebraska plains was complicated by weather. It occurred not as a formal procedure, but as a series of pragmatic decisions made by a community working with the materials available. The 2 large men were disarmed. They were carrying revolvers, which were removed by Otto Brower, and a carpenter named Wilhelm Setz with the specific no-ceremony efficiency of men who had grown up hunting and found the mechanics of the thing unremarkable. They were placed in the church's back storage room, which had a bolt on the outside of the door, and given blankets and a lamp, and told that when the storm broke, someone would escort them to the county line and they would not return. The larger of the 2, the one who had reached for the deed, had a broken hand from the encounter with Liesel Brower and the tin box. He was given a splint fashioned by Marin from 2 pieces of kindling and a strip torn from a pew cushion. He did not thank her. She did not require it. Cress presented a different problem. He was, unlike his 2 associates, a man who had paper, who had names, contracts, relationships in Omaha that connected upward and outward in ways that, as the storm broke and the road south opened, could produce consequences for Blackwood that even the deed in the tin box might not be sufficient to forestall. August and Marin sat with this problem for an hour in the grain room at the mill while the blizzard peaked outside. The conversation they has never been documented. What was decided in it has been inferred by the people who came later and tried to reconstruct the sequence of events, and the inferences are uncomfortable, and they are probably correct. Harlan Cress left Blackwood on the morning of January 17, 1888, when the storm broke. He left on foot without his document case, without the deed, and without the names and contracts he had arrived with, these having been, during the 4 days of the blizzard, the subject of a negotiation that Marin conducted with him personally, 1 session per day, in the front pew of the church, with the specific unhurried patience of a woman who understood that 4 days in a blizzard with no food source except the goodwill of the people she had come to help disappear was a negotiation environment that favored her position considerably. What Cress agreed to has never been fully established. What is known is that no legal action was subsequently brought against any resident of Blackwood by Chatham Land or any associate entity, and that Cress himself retired from private investigation work in the spring of 1888 and relocated to Portland, Oregon, where he worked as a notary until his death in 1901. What his face looked like when he walked south from Blackwood on the morning of January 17th, what specific understanding he carried with him about what had transpired in that church and in that grain room over 4 days of blizzard, was observed by Marin from the church steps and described by her in the 1981 document, in a single sentence. He walked like a man who had been shown something he had not known existed and had decided, correctly, that the appropriate response was distance.
The impossible choice arrived on the 2nd day of the blizzard, January 14th, and it arrived not in the form of a dramatic confrontation, but in the form of a small girl's voice asking a question that had no good answer. Ida Hendricks had sent a message with her farmhand, a young man named Pell, who knew the 4 miles of field between her farm and Blackwood the way all plains people knew their immediate geography, by feel and count, and the specific angle of the wind. A message that arrived at the church at noon on January 14th, and said in Ida's direct, unornamented hand, "The child is well. She asks for her mother. There is a matter you should know. Pell will tell you." What Pell told Marin was this. On the morning of January 13th,
Shortly after August had delivered Lena to the Hendricks farm, an eighth person had arrived at Ida's door. Not from the south, from the north. He was alive, barely, frostbitten at the fingers and the ears, barely coherent, having turned back from the open plain when the blizzard hit, before he was far enough north to be past the point for turn. His name was Geddes, the man Vorney had sent to Marin's house on the night of January 12th, one of Vorney's chosen men. He had been in the first group sent north, and he had turned back, and Ida had taken him in because Ida took in everything that arrived at her door alive, on principle, regardless of what it was when it had been warm. Geddes, Pell said, talking. He had been talking since he arrived, not coherently, not consistently, in the fragmented, revelation-dense way of a man whose mind has been broken open by cold and fear and the specific horror of understanding, while walking north into a blizzard on an open plain, what the instruction he had been following actually intended. He was talking about Vorney. He was talking about the stakes and the white rope. He was talking about other things, things that Pell would not repeat to Marin directly, but that had made Ida Hendricks, who had survived 4 Nebraska winters and buried a husband and been unimpressed by virtually everything life had shown her, sit down in her kitchen chair and not get up for an hour. The impossible choice was this. Marin had go to Geddes. She could leave the church, leave the 163 people who were anchored in their current state of fragile emerging clarity, partly by her presence in the room. Leave Elias Vorney sitting in the front pew with the specific patient stillness of a man who was watching for the moment when the architecture of the opposition shifted, and she could walk 4 miles through a peak blizzard to reach a man who might tell her things she needed to know, or might tell her nothing coherent, or might die before she arrived. She could do this and risk the church, risk the people in it, risk everything they had built in the last 12 hours. Or she could stay, and Geddes might die, and what he knew might die with him, and whatever he was trying to say about Vorney, whatever additional dimension of what had been done to Blackwood he was fracturing apart trying to communicate, would go unheard, and she would spend the rest of her life not knowing, and not knowing would have its own particular weight. She sat with the choice for 4 minutes. Then she looked at August and said, "I have to go." He looked at her. He said, "I know." She said, "If anything changes here, if Vorney moves, if Kress moves, if anything shifts." She said it without finishing it, because finishing it would have required naming the specific action she was authorizing him to take in her absence, and naming it would have made it a thing with a shape, and she was not ready for it to have that shape yet. August said, "Go, I have it." She believed him. She went. What Geddes told her, over 2 hours on a pallet in Ida Hendricks's kitchen, with Lena asleep on the bench, and the blizzard shaking the walls, and Ida sitting in her chair by the fire with the rifle across her knees, was enough. It was more than enough. It was the specific, terrible sufficiency of information that resolves every remaining question, while simultaneously making the resolved questions worse than the open ones had been. She listened to all of it. She did not look away. And when she was finished, she sat for a moment with her hands folded in her lap, and her face arranged in the expression she wore when she was absorbing something difficult and refusing to let it break her posture. And then she picked up Lena and held her for a long time and said nothing. What she chose in that kitchen was not to use what Geddes had told her to destroy Elias Vorney more completely than she already had. What she chose was to use it to protect the people he had touched, to take the specific knowledge of what he had done and to whom and over what period of time, and to transform it from a weapon into a record. She chose documentation over destruction. She chose the archive over the fire. It was the morally complicated choice, because making it permanent meant living with it, meant carrying it, meant spending years ensuring it survived and reached the right hands, and it meant that Elias Vorney, at least for now, at least until the road south opened and the sheriff arrived, would live. She was not certain she had chosen correctly. She was never, in all the years that followed, entirely certain.
In the first 24 hours after the reckoning, the people of Blackwood did 3 things. They searched for the 8 who had walked north. They went out in pairs and threes, roped together, in the intervals between the blizzard's worst gusts, following the line of stakes to the northwest. They found 5 of the 8 alive, disoriented, frostbitten in varying degrees, in 3 cases barely ambulatory, huddled in a loose group approximately 2 miles north of the cemetery fence, having stopped, apparently, when the white rope disappeared beneath the snow and the visible world reduced to nothing, and the instruction they had been following ran out of geography. 3 were not found until the storm broke 4 days later. Silas Prout was one of them. He was found 7 miles north, alone, face down in the snow, his work coat still open at the front, his hands folded beneath his chest, in the specific position of a man who had lain down deliberately. Whether this was a choice, or the final collapse of a body that had simply run out of heat, is a question that the Custer County coroner declined to answer directly in his report, which described the cause of death as exposure, and declined to speculate further. Elias Vorn remained in the church under the watch of Otto Brauer and Wilhelm Setz, and 4 other men who worked in shifts. He did not attempt to leave. He ate what was brought to him. He slept in the front pew. He spoke very little, and when he spoke it was not to argue or to persuade, or to demonstrate any of the machinery that had run for 30 years with such terrible efficiency. He was quiet in the way of a mechanism that has been switched off. Not broken, not destroyed, but no longer running, waiting with the patience of something that does not require fuel to endure. On the morning of January 17th, when the storm broke, and the sky above Blackwood went from dead white to a clear, brutal, almost painful blue, Marin Solt walked into the church and stood in front of Elias Vorn and placed the completed document on the pew beside him. All of it. Everything. Harrow Creek, and the stakes, and the deed, and what Geddes had said on the pallet in Ida Hendricks's kitchen. She said, "The sheriff arrives from Broken Bow in 2 days, weather permitting." He said, "I know." She said, "You could run." He looked at the document and then at her and said, "Where would I go?" She looked at him for a moment, at the stillness of him, at the thing behind his eyes that was not peace, and was not fear, and was not guilt in any form she recognized, and she said, "I don't know. I genuinely don't know what there is inside you that would constitute a destination." He was quiet. She left.
The sheriff arrived from Broken Bow on the morning of January 19th, 1888, 2 days after the blizzard broke, riding ahead of a supply wagon that the county had dispatched when a farmhand named Pell arrived in town on foot with a document written in a woman's hand that the deputy on duty described in his subsequent report as the most organized account of a criminal matter he had encountered in 11 years of frontier law enforcement. Elias Vorn was taken into custody without incident. He walked to the deputy's horse and stood beside it and waited to be told what to do next. And the deputy, who had expected resistance and had brought 2 additional men in preparation for it, found the absence of resistance more unsettling than resistance would have been. The subsequent legal proceedings were, by the standards of Nebraska territorial justice in 1888, remarkably substantive, which is to say they were deeply inadequate, but more thorough than nothing. Vorn was charged with fraud, incitement to harm, and the wrongful deaths of 3 Blackwood residents, the legal architecture of the territory not yet possessing language sufficient to describe what he had actually done. He was tried in Broken Bow in the spring of 1888 before a circuit judge who had read the document Marin had written and had the specific, quietly horrified expression of a man who had been doing this work for 20 years and had encountered a category of crime for which his training had not prepared him. Vorn was convicted on the fraud charge and 2 of the 3 wrongful death charges and sentenced to 14 years in the Nebraska State Penitentiary at Lincoln. He served 9. He was released in 1897 on grounds of declining health. He was 56 years old. He moved, under what circumstances, under whose supervision, by what mechanism of oversight, no official record specifies, to a small town in eastern Colorado. His name appears in no document after 1898. Whether he died there, whether he moved again, whether the machinery that had run so efficiently in Harrow Creek and Blackwood found a 3rd location and a 3rd congregation and a 3rd window of desperate, isolated, meaning-hungry human beings to open itself toward. This is not known. This has never been established. The Colorado records from that period are incomplete in ways that the relevant archivists have described as unusual but not explicable,
which is the particular formulation that appears in documents when the people writing them have decided that explicable is not a place they wish to go. By 1891, Marin Sold had left Blackwood with Lena and filed on new land in Lancaster County, Nebraska. Not the Pennsylvania county of her childhood, but a different Lancaster, as though she had needed the name without the history. She farmed it alone for 6 years. In 1897, she married a man named Court Alderman, a widower with 2 sons, a quiet man who worked hard and asked few questions, and had, she noted in a letter to Liesl Brower dated that autumn, the particular virtue of being someone whose stillments came from contentment rather than calculation, and who therefore did not make her count the seconds between sentences. She died in 1931 at the age of 74. Lena, by then, had 4 children of her own, none of whom were told the story of Blackwood until they were old enough to carry it without being bent by it. August Reyes went south after the trial. He spent 2 years in Texas, then moved to New Mexico, where he filed on land near the town of Las Cruces, and grew chili and kept horses, and was described by his neighbors as a man of unusual competence and unusual reticence, and great, somewhat intimidating kindness. He wrote to Marin twice a year, every year, until 1929, when the letters stopped. Whether he died that year or simply stopped writing has never been determined. His land in New Mexico was sold in 1931 to a family who reported finding, in the storage room of the main house, a wooden box containing a collection of documents in careful writing handwriting, and a daguerreotype of a woman they did not recognize, with the name Clara written on the back in ink that had faded to the color of old grass.
The sealed records of Custer County, Nebraska, from the period January through June of 1888, were placed under administrative restriction in 1889 by order of the Nebraska Territorial Governor's Office, and remained restricted for 61 years, until a partial release in 1950 that made available approximately 40% of the relevant documents. The remaining 60%, the portion that archivists at the Nebraska State Historical Society have identified, based on inventory records, as including the full trial transcript, the coroner's reports on the 3 confirmed deaths, and a sealed exhibit described only as the Vorn Correspondence File, has never been released. Requests filed under Nebraska Public Record Statutes in 1967, 1974, 1989, and 2003 have each been responded to with variations of the same language. The requested materials are currently unavailable due to ongoing administrative review. The administrative review that began in 1889 has been ongoing for 137 years. The deed from the tin box, the pre-signed property transfer document that established the financial motive for what happened in Blackwood, was entered into evidence at the 1888 trial and should, by standard archival procedure, be held today in the Custer County Courthouse in Broken Bow. It is not there. The exhibit log from the trial lists it as item 14. The courthouse's evidence archive lists items 1 through 13 and items 15 through 22 from the same trial. Item 14 does not appear. The courthouse staff, when asked, described the gap as a filing irregularity. The Chetham Land and Agricultural Credit Company dissolved in 1891. Its parent entity, a holding company registered in Delaware, was absorbed into a larger financial concern in 1893. The chain of corporate succession from that concern to entities that exist today has been traced by at least 2 independent researchers to firms that are currently active. Neither researcher published their findings. One described in a private letter receiving a visit from a lawyer she did not recognize, who had been very polite and very specific about the nature of the legal exposure she might be creating for herself by continuing her research. She stopped. The stakes are still there. August Reyes's account of finding them, included in Marin's 1891 document, describes 31 stakes on the eastern end of the line alone. In 1954, a farmer plowing the northern edge of where had been Blackwood Cemetery Field, Blackwood itself having been fully abandoned by 1895, unearthed a wooden stake approximately 3 feet long, painted white at the top, of a type and age consistent with the 1880s. He described it to a local newspaper reporter as a curiosity, a relic, the kind of thing the ground returns eventually from that period of settlement. The reporter noted that the stake appeared to have been one of a series. The remnants of another were visible a short distance away, the rope between them long since rotted to fibers. The reporter described the fibers as white. The article ran on page 7. No follow-up was published. The one fact that cannot be explained, the detail that sits at the bottom of everything, that every researcher who has spent time with this material eventually arrives at, and then finds themselves unable to leave, is the number. In Harrow Creek in 1880, 31 people walked into a frozen river and did not return. In Blackwood in 1888, on the morning of January 13th,
8 people began walking north before Marin and August's intervention contained the movement. 3 were not recovered until after the storm. 3 died. The number, again, is 3. Researchers have noted this. Researchers have noted that the Vorn correspondence file, item 14, the missing exhibit, the 60% of Custer County records that have been under administrative review for 137 years, would, if it existed, and if it contains what the inventory suggests it contains, potentially resolve the question of whether the number 3 was a coincidence, or whether it was in some sense that requires a category of intention that the legal vocabulary of 1888 could not accommodate, a target. Whether Vorn, on the morning of January 13th, had calculated a number, and was working toward it with the same precision he had used to place the stakes, and time the storm, and pre-signed the 8. No one has been able to answer this. The file is unavailable. The administrative review is ongoing.
What the story of Blackwood reveals about human nature is not what we wanted to reveal. We wanted to reveal the existence of monsters, discrete, identifiable, categorically separate from the rest of us, operating by a logic so alien that their actions constitute evidence of their otherness rather than evidence of what is possible. Elias Vorne is not useful to us in that way. He is not a monster in the sense that requires us to place him outside the human boundary. He is a human being who looked at the machinery of human need, the need for meaning, for community, for a reason that suffering is not random, and decided to use it as an instrument. He did not invent the need. He did not create the isolation or the poverty or the grief that made the people of Blackwood available to him. He found those things already present in the world, already doing their work on already vulnerable people, and he built something on top of them. The disturbing truth is not that a man like Elias Vorne existed. The disturbing truth is that everything he needed to do what he did was already there before he arrived. The plains provided the isolation, the economy provided the desperation, the theology provided the framework. He provided only the specific, patient, 7-year application of a skill he had been developing since childhood. He was not an anomaly. He was an optimization. What this means for us today is not comfortable. We live in an era of Blackwoods, not geographic ones, not frontier settlements cut off by winter roads, but communities of the mind and the network and the algorithm, isolated from countervailing information, organized around figures who have learned with Vorne's precision the specific vocabulary of meaning and belonging and divine sanction that makes a person willing to walk north when told to. The mechanism is not new. The delivery system is, and the delivery system is faster, and it scales, and it does not require 7 years of patient pastoral trust building because it can manufacture the feeling of pastoral trust in 17 minutes of targeted content. The plains are everywhere now. The blizzard comes in different forms. And the people drawing lines in the frozen ground, painting the rope white so it disappears into the conditions they have arranged. They are not anomalies either. They are optimizations of the same ancient machinery, and they are watching the sky for the same window that Vorne watched for, the moment of maximum vulnerability, just before the crisis, when people can still see it coming and still have enough energy to either fight it or surrender to it, and when the right voice, offering the right meaning, in the right register of unhurried, resonant certainty, can determine which direction that energy goes. The question that haunts, the one that Marin Salt spent 40 years not fully answering, the one that August Reyes's letters circle without landing, the one that sits at the bottom of the sealed file and the missing exhibit, and the 137 years of ongoing administrative review, is this. Elias Vorne told the congregation of Blackwood that he gave them meaning. He told them that without him they would be left with suffering that was random, and endurance that was pointless, and lives that resolved into nothing. He told them this in the voice of a man who had spent 30 years studying how to make people believe things, in a context specifically engineered to maximize their susceptibility, in a moment of maximum desperation and minimum alternatives. He told them this, and it worked, and the reason it worked is the reason it has always worked, which is that the thing he was offering, meaning, purpose, a shape to suffering, is something that human beings need as genuinely and as urgently as they need water. The question is not whether Vorne was wrong. He was wrong. The question is whether the need he exploited is a vulnerability we can harden against, or whether it is so fundamental to what we are that it will always be available to the next person who finds it and decides to use it as an instrument. The question is whether there is a version of meaning that is not available for use as a weapon.
The question is whether Marinsalt, who chose documentation over destruction, who chose the archive over the fire, who spent 40 years making sure this story survived and reached the right hands, whether she found it. Whether what she built in the years after Blackwood was an answer to that question, or only a better record of the question itself. The file is sealed. The review is ongoing. The stakes are still in the ground.
If this story stayed with you, if it made you think, made you uncomfortable, or made you angry, then it did its job. Because the story of Blackwood is not really about a blizzard, and it is not really about 1888, and it is not really about a preacher with a different name in every county. It is about the distance between desperation and surrender, and what fills that distance, and who benefits from filling it. So drop a comment below with this question. If you had been in that church on the morning of January 13th, 1888, if you had heard Elias Vorne's voice for 7 years and trusted it, and the road south was buried, and the winter was real, and the meaning he offered was the only meaning available, would you have walked north? I want to know. I think the answer matters more than most people are willing to admit. If you found this channel for the first time today, subscribe now, because every story we tell here is one they tried to bury. We bring them back, every time, without exception.